BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
Welcome to Sunday. Pope Francis has appointed 6 women to sit alongside the cardinals on the committee responsible for overseeing the way the Vatican is run. We'll ask one of them, the former Labour Minister Ruth Kelly, whether it heralds real change in the part women play in the Church's life. Also in the programme, Christian aid on what the future holds for Lebanon after this week's massive explosion.
What we really would like to get very clear to people is that the explosion that happened on Tuesday was really the last straw and part of a wider crisis situation, that really Lebanon itself was just a powder keg waiting to explode.
And Sunday goes on a summer search for spiritual solace in the age of COVID.
And notice how you are right now. Notice what's arising for you. Some thoughts may be coming in. Allow them without resistance.
And if any thoughts do come in or arise, do tweet them, BBC R4 Sunday. When India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi laid the foundation stone for a Hindu temple in the city of Ayodhya this week, he called it the dawn of a new era. It was certainly a hugely significant moment in a dispute with roots that go back many centuries. We're joined by our correspondent Rahul Tandon, because, Rahul, the history of the site is itself contested, isn't it?
It is indeed, really, and this is a story, Ed, that you've discussed on a number of occasions, and I think you're going to discuss on more occasions over the years to come. It's an important chapter in a story that's dominated Indian political life and Indian religious life for the past 40 years, some would say, since independence. Ayodhya is a small city, a sleepy city that I've been to on numerous occasions in India's most populous state, Uttar Pradesh. And it was on the 6th of December 1992, a day that many Indians will remember vividly. Many of your listeners may remember those crackly reports on the telephone from Mark Tully describing what happened, where a mosque that was built in the 16th century, the Babri Masjid, was torn down by a huge group of a Hindu mob, I think would be the way that we would have to describe it. They claimed that the masjid, the mosque, was basically built on the site of an old Hindu temple, that the spot is where the Hindu god Lord Ram was born. After that, the case went to the courts. For many years, they didn't seem to want to make a decision on it, not wanting to alienate India's majority Hindu community or India's sizable Muslim minority. But last year, we finally got a verdict from the court. They awarded the land to the Hindus. Muslims were given another plot of land in the city to build a mosque there. Though interestingly, when they made that verdict, they said that actually the destruction of the mosque was wrong in the first place.
And the Prime Minister made a real splash in the way that he did it this week, laid the foundation stone.
He did, and I think there's no surprise there, though. Remember that Mr. Modi was there in the 1990s as this movement began with the BJP. It's the movement to build a temple there that in effect brought them to power in India. And when he was there in the 1990s, he said he wouldn't return until work on the temple actually began. And that's where he was this week, drawing criticism from some, because of course it was in the middle of the COVID pandemic. But he said, look, the site had been liberated. This was a new era for India, that a grand house for Lord Ram would be fully constructed. And as he was there with this big silver brick that was being laid there as the foundations for a temple that he hopes will be built before the next elections, which of course could boost his popularity again, 160 million people in India were watching this on television. And this is a story and this is an issue that has become very popular within some Hindus in India, who believe that it represents the fact that India is a Hindu country, not a secular country. And some would say represents a movement from that secular past. But certainly within a majority of Hindus in the country, this move, though contentious within the Muslim community, is seen as an extremely popular one.
Well, I was going to ask, what about reaction from the Muslims? Because I noticed that Pakistan has been very critical of it.
Pakistan has been critical of it, and I think some of the most telling statements came from those who had opposed the decision legally. They basically said the Prime Minister should not have gone to attend this ceremony because he is the leader of a secular country and should not be getting involved in this particular dispute in such a public way. Other Muslims that I spoke to this week remembered what happened in 1992, and they said as the mosque was razed, the faith of minorities in the country were raised as well. Others called on the Prime Minister to say, OK, we may draw a line over what's happened in Ayodhya, but what about other disputed sites in Varanasi, in Mathura as well? We want the Prime Minister to come out now and say that we won't see Hindu temples being built on those sites. It's another chapter in this contentious issue, but one has to say, Ed, that it's divided India like it's never been divided before, and those divisions run still very deep, I think, between many communities.
Well, Rahul, as you say, we're almost certain to be coming back to that story, but for the moment, thank you very much indeed. The Jehovah's Witnesses will be among a number of faith groups to give evidence and answer questions at the independent inquiry into child sex abuse this week. The hearing will investigate the organisation's management of child protection and how they respond to allegations of abuse. Abuse survivors want the witnesses to issue a public apology for what they say are the religion's inadequate policies. One of them, we've called him John Abbas to protect his identity, has written an open letter on what he would like the organisation to do.
Earlier this year, Shane Brady, counsel for the Jehovah's Witnesses, gave his opening statement at the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse. Jehovah's Witnesses do not feel they're immune from the problem of child sexual abuse, he said. It has happened. Unfortunately, he failed to use the opportunity to apologise to abuse survivors. As a researcher into religious discourses on child sexual abuse, I've learned that Jehovah's Witnesses do not publicly apologise. Rather, they claim they don't have the institutional settings that other religions have that make them likely to have a problem. 4 years ago, in Australia, the Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Sexual Abuse worked through the files of the Jehovah's Witnesses. They revealed that 108 of the religion's 1,006 alleged abusers held the institutional position of elder or ministerial servant at the time of the alleged abuse. And 53 of these people had allegedly abused at least 131 children outside of their own families. According to the Royal Commission's report, Jehovah's Witnesses said there can be no safer institution than one that does not present opportunities for predatory behaviour. To me, those words feel like mockery. You see, when I was 10, I was openly groomed in my kingdom hall and also at assemblies and conventions and on congregation coach trips to those religious events, and subsequently raped by a non-family member, a spiritual brother of my congregation of Jehovah's Witnesses. The discourse of Jehovah's Witnesses, however, aims to move us all away from the past. At a preliminary hearing last year, Shane Brady refuted the need for a specific case study of the Jehovah's Witnesses into present child protection. He said case studies are looking retrospectively, not at the current situation and not looking forward. In my opinion, such a perspective allows their UK data on child sexual abuse to stay hidden, and children hurt by their past policies and cultural practices to be silenced. At tomorrow's hearing, questions will be put to the representative of the Jehovah's Witnesses. I appeal to him now. This time, please take the opportunity to apologise for the sexual abuse your elders, ministerial servants and others have committed. Stop hiding the past. Start apologising.
Well, we asked the Jehovah's Witnesses for a response, and they told us that an explanation of their beliefs and policies will be presented during the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse tomorrow. Pope Francis has appointed 6 women to senior positions in the Vatican, his latest effort to make good on the promises he's made about improving the gender balance at the top of the Church. The 6 will sit on the Council for the Economy, and one of them is Ruth Kelly, a former Labour Cabinet Minister and now Pro-Vice-Chancellor for Research and Enterprise at St Mary's University, Twickenham. She told me what the role was.
This is the council that's set up by the Pope to oversee all the sort of administrative and financial affairs of the Holy See, the Roman Curia, which is the establishment of the Roman Catholic Church in Rome, and all its various bodies and institutions. So it's the governing council, so it can scrutinise any particular body, it can set policies, and basically it's vigilant in making sure they are properly run.
It's hugely important, isn't it? Because particularly the finances have got into all sorts of problems in the past.
It is hugely important. It's a key role in the Vatican, and it's wonderful to see that Pope Francis has not only created this body, but he's determined to make sure that there are lay experts involved at the highest level of administration in the Vatican. And I think the appointment of 7 lay experts alongside the 8 cardinals, 6 of whom are women, is a really important signal of Pope Francis's determination to include lay people at the highest levels.
Were you surprised to be approached? Did it come out of the blue?
Totally out of the blue, very surprised. Absolutely wonderful to get a call to see if I was interested. But of course I am. It's a huge honour and privilege to be able to serve the Church in this way. And, I'm very aware of the responsibility too.
And how significant is the fact that, as you mentioned, 6 of the 7 lay members are women? And I think these are arguably the most senior administrative jobs in the Vatican that women have ever held.
Yes, well, Pope Francis is very, very determined to include the broadest range of voices as possible in the running of the Church and indeed of the Vatican. So I think symbolically it is really important that 6 out of the 7 are women, but they're also women with a certain professional prestige and competence who can bring their own independent views to the table. So I do think this is a forerunner of other changes that we will see in the Church in the years to come.
That's interesting. Like what?
Well, women being involved in other areas of the Vatican governance and church governance as well. I mean, I've actually served on the Archdiocese of Westminster in England for the past 10 years as one of the trustees. And it's great to see lay people of men and women being included in those sorts of forums. So I do think this sort of lead from the Vatican, from the very, very top, will set a very powerful message to others in the Church.
But he's taken his time about it, hasn't he? He made his commitment to improve the gender balance in the Vatican right at the beginning of his pontificate, and only now is he taking a step like this.
Well, I don't think you can criticise him for not making a bold step with these latest appointments. So he's clearly very, very determined. There are other women who've recently been appointed in positions of responsibility too. But you're right to say that this is now critical in the Church's administration and infrastructure.
Well, can I just push you on that a little bit? Because, of course, these are administrative jobs. The ministry is not open to women, and there's no sign of that changing. So I'm just wondering where the kind of advance for women that you'd like to see might come in a way that really changes the character of the Church.
I think this will change the character of the Church, actually. I mean, it's long-standing Catholic teaching that ordained ministry is reserved for men. But there's no reason why women, for example, can't be involved in the selection of candidates for the priesthood or the formation of priests. There's no reason, in fact, why they can't be involved at every level of governance. So I do think this is quite an important statement by the Pope.
Do you think that women should be able to be priests?
Well, I'm not a theologian, and I'm quite happy to leave matters of theology to those who are better qualified than I am. It's been the teaching of the Church, as I understand it, that those posts are reserved to men. But I think there are really important, critical roles in the Church's functioning that women can perform and actually should be performing. There is absolutely no reason why women can't be involved in running the Church. And I don't just mean administration. I mean being involved as a woman has just been appointed as a minister in the Vatican government and working with the Secretary of State. These are really, really important roles in the life of the Church.
And just finally, do you feel at all daunted at the prospect of a job which will sometimes mean taking the Vatican on, because it is famously sort of serpentine sometimes in its dealings and very secure in its own ability to tame outsiders, or appears to have been that way?
A little daunted. It would be unnatural if I weren't, but also very much looking forward to it. And I hope that I'm going to enjoy the role tremendously, because it is a fascinating insight into the workings of the Church and the Vatican, and a real responsibility goes hand in hand with that.
Ruth Kelly, where the former Archbishop of Canterbury, Dr. Rowan Williams, said the COVID pandemic had triggered a historic spiritual moment. He was reflecting on, among other things, the way people have taken to online churches, temples and mosques. app downloads and online classes suggest increasing numbers are also exploring other sources of spiritual solace. So this summer, Sunday is going to explore some too. We begin this week with yoga therapy.
Let's begin by settling in and becoming comfortable in our own bodies. My name's Jane Craggs and I've been practicing yoga for upwards of about 25 years now, I guess. So if you're lying down, just find a pleasant, comfortable connection to the ground and start to settle the body. I didn't want to be quiet. I didn't want to be still. I wanted to party. And then it was later on when I got into yoga through having an illness and a burnout. And notice how you are right now. Notice what's arising for you. Some thoughts may be coming in. Allow them without resistance. The yoga that I teach now is called Svastha Yoga. Svastha is to be established, fully established in the self in a balanced way. So it's kind of bringing yourself back into that center, into that place of steadiness. And that includes your physical and your mental health as well. So on the next inhalation, take the arms up, allow them to float from that radiating center. And then Shanti. This type of yoga is rooted in the ancient texts. It's originated from Upanishad and Vedic practices. Later, it's then come from the Yoga Sutra, so the Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, which is said to be between 2,000 and 5,000 years old. Why the Yoga Sutras is so significant is that it's a practice manual and it's very succinct, both for the spiritually advanced practitioner but also for the householder. So it's a very compassionate text in that way because it provides practices for people at different stages of their spiritual journey. The pandemic has obviously brought a whole range of different issues into the classroom or into the sort of Zoom room, if you like. Obviously, there's a lot of mental health issues that have arisen and people with existing conditions which have been exacerbated by the lockdown. So I've been doing a lot more one-to-one work with some of them. I've actually had a number of students who've had COVID as well and who are in recovery and who are really struggling to breathe normally. So again, I've been doing sort of therapeutic sessions with them. The bottom line is to help them to steady their minds around whatever aspect they're dealing with in relation to the virus. And at the end of each exhalation, as you fall into the cushion of the out-breath, notice the pause and continue to sink into that quietness. Sound is so resonant, and we work specifically with Sanskrit because Sanskrit has spiritual resonance. The sounds themselves carry the actual meaning. In Sanskrit, if you chant the word Shanti, which means peace, when you chant Shanti, the sound is peace. What we're trying to do when we do a sound is, if we're bringing a feeling to it, we want to cultivate the feeling first and then bring the sound in and keep that feeling that we have had alongside that. So whenever we feel during our day that something's overwhelming, if we can go back to that sound, you recall that feeling and that feeling comes back. And the more you use the sound, the deeper the samskara or this kind of groove of that uplifting feeling becomes. You see it in all religions. Sound is so deeply powerful. Hinduism and yoga are, of course, united. You don't have to have a faith to practice, but you do want to connect to something deeper. For some people, that could be the force behind all nature, whatever you believe that is, or it can be then a sense of the divine.
Allow the breath in to arise, and at your own pace, let that sound open you up. Shanti, Shanti, Shanti.
Jane Craggs from Yoga Space in Manchester, and next week we are immersing ourselves in a gong spa. It's 29 minutes to 8. You're listening to Sunday. Still to come in the programme, there are lots of books about murders. We have a detective tale that isn't about tracking down a murderer. It's about tracking down what Thomas Becket was reading when he was murdered at Canterbury Cathedral 850 years ago. French President Emmanuel Macron will host an international video conference to raise money for Lebanon today. Yesterday, the people of Beirut came out in their thousands to express their rage about the government failures they blame for Tuesday's massive explosion and all the misery it brought. Lina Sinjab is our correspondent in the city. And Lina, I think you covered those demonstrations. It sounds as if at times things got quite violent.
Yes, indeed. Protesters have been protesting since October 2019, angry about the corruption, angry about the finance, the economy, the politics. But now it's their anger is about their own safety. They can't believe it that these political elites, these leaders, rulers, allowed something like this to happen. They knew about the explosives being at the port for 6 years and did nothing to protect the city and protect the people. So the protests yesterday were adamant, the protesters were adamant that they don't want to only protest. They went into government building, went into the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Ministry of Finance and other buildings, tried to break through them and occupy them. But actually the army fired back with rubber bullets and tear gas and left dozens injured.
And what's the position there this morning?
Well, it's a Sunday morning, it's the early hours of the morning, it's quiet. I'm standing actually by the seaside, overlooking the port area where the explosion took place, but also on the Corniche I can still see some people came back to their daily life activities like running, jogging. I can see a line of fishermen trying to set up their fishing equipment so that they go to the sea and fish. But of course, these are the early hours of the morning. On the side of the east side of Beirut, where the destruction is still is massive, and many people were forced to be homeless. The clearing operation, the rescue operation, is also still ongoing, looking for the missing. The government says that at least 60 people might be missing after the explosion. But who knows? There are many apartments and buildings that fall apart, so maybe there will be other people under the debris.
And what are the government saying in response to the charges being made against them and to the very evident anger of many people?
That's the issue, that, everyone in the government is trying to put the blame on someone else, and that's what makes the protesters even more angry. They arrested or put under home arrest at least 16 port officials, but for people on the ground, they say that every single member of the government or the parties behind or the political elites should be held responsible and held accountable. The president came out to say that he knew about the explosive in July 2020, but he had no authority over the port. And people are saying, if you're the president and don't have an authority over the port, then you should resign immediately. And they're saying the same for many other politicians. The issue is, even until today, none of the politicians, president, prime minister, speaker of the parliament, went to hospitals or damaged areas to tap on the shoulders of people and tell them, we are standing with you. So people feel that these are not there, represent them anymore. They want them out of the government.
Nina Sinjab in Beirut, thank you very much indeed for talking to us this morning and reporting on what's happening in Beirut. Mairead Collins is Christian Aid's Senior Advocacy Advisor on Syria, Iraq and Lebanon, and she told me about the aids that's needed most urgently in Beirut.
Our partners have been doing assessments on the ground. At the moment, what they're seeing as the first kind of needs is going to be food, basic medications, and also repairs to houses, blankets, water, and basic kind of hygiene and disinfection materials, clothes, mattresses, blankets, and also, of course, mobilising volunteers to remove the rubble in the areas closest to the port and most damaged by the explosion.
So very much emergency stuff. Looking ahead a bit, one of the problems, presumably, is that the explosion stopped everything at that port, and that port is the main source of imports by sea for the whole country.
Absolutely. Lebanon imports 90% of its grain, and with bread really as the kind of the staple in homes with almost every meal, this has a massive impact when there isn't that location for the imports to come in. And also there was a large store of grain there. There was around 85% of the grain was stored and has now been destroyed, alongside medications that were also stored there.
It does seem extraordinary to be talking about the possibility of people having real difficulty getting enough to eat in a country which has a reputation for huge wealth in some areas and among some parts of society, great beauty, a holiday destination at one time and so forth.
Yeah, no, and I mean, I've been to Lebanon many times. It's an absolutely beautiful country, very rich culture, fantastic place. But I think what we really would like to get very clear to people is that the explosion that happened on Tuesday was really the last straw and part of a wider crisis situation that really Lebanon itself was just a powder keg waiting to explode. Our partner that's on the ground that's been assessing the damage in and around Beirut this week, earlier this year, as far back as March, they were also assessing homes in terms of the food poverty that existed at that stage. And normally this partner would be dealing with displaced communities, with Syrian refugees, Palestine refugees, but they were finding at that stage that even Lebanese homes didn't have as much as a loaf of bread in the house. And then 2 weeks ago, again, speaking to the same partner, it had gotten to an even worse state of crisis where they spoke about families where they were skipping meals, where there was one family that he particularly talked about where they were relying entirely on the kindness of neighbours to give them food, where the children were scavenging in rubbish, begging on the streets for food. So that was Monday, we'll say, in Lebanon. And with the explosion on Tuesday, it has just brought all of this into really sharp focus, that there was already a crisis, an economic crisis that need not have happened as a result of decades at this stage of corruption and mismanagement by the government. And so it is a travesty, and it's something that need never have gotten to this stage.
There was clearly anger boiling up because of the economic crisis anyway, but the events of this week have, it seems, tipped people over the edge, and people have simply lost faith in the way government happens or doesn't happen in Lebanon. I
mean, it's particularly clear people are out on the streets in Lebanon, but this is something that has been boiling for much, much longer. The October Revolution, as it's referred to, the popular protest movement, started in October of last year, and that was a case of people coming together of all faiths, of all politics, and demanding that the government step down, that there be complete change, and that there be an end to corruption in all of its forms, because people are sick of the injustice, sick of the inequality. I think patience ran out a very long time ago, but now this is the absolute last straw.
Lebanon has this very peculiar political system, what they call confessional politics, where the various offices of state are divided up among the religious groups. That was intended to make the country live in some kind of harmony, which it obviously failed to do during the Civil War. But do you think that that increases the danger of corruption because each group wants to look after its own?
When you do have this kind of division, there is the potential for it to be used, kind of populist ideas where you're trying to keep people in their groups and stuck on that identity, and it can be used to set people against each other. But I would say that the movement and the protest movement last year, one aspect of that was really to push back against that and for people to not want to be put into their groups anymore, to see themselves as Lebanese first and to want to see that reflected and not to want to be put into these brackets.
Mairead Collins. There's a book out called The Book in the Cathedral, and if that makes you think of T.S. Eliot's Murder in the Cathedral, that's quite deliberate because the subject is indeed Thomas Becket. But very unusually, it's more about his reading list than his martyrdom. The historian Christopher de Hamel is the author, and he told me that St. Thomas was big box office after his death 850 years ago.
Thomas Becket is probably the most famous and best documented medieval or non-royal medieval English person. And that is really because of the cult of Becket. He died in 1170. He was canonised 3 years later. And that pilgrim site in Canterbury was the biggest in Northern Europe. Hundreds of thousands of people a year came there, including, of course, Chaucer's pilgrims. And they visited the shrine. They were shown relics, if they were important. They got as close as they could to the shrine. He did miracles. He was an extraordinary figure in the public imagination of the Middle Ages.
But not books. People weren't shown his books, were they?
It's an interesting observation that, generally speaking, books which belonged to saints were not regarded as relics. What people wanted was bones, body parts, hair clippings, or at one level further down, clothes. So items that saints had worn were regarded as holy. Mere books, which belonged to them, were not sacred. And it always seemed to me very interesting. That is completely different from the way we regard it now. If we had a tooth or a pair of socks, which belonged to William Shakespeare, slightly interesting. But if we had a book from Shakespeare's library, it would be to us a real relic, because it would be a window to his mind, especially if it showed signs of use. But in the Middle Ages, they wanted bones, they wanted bits.
And your book is a detective story, really, about how you tracked down one of the books Thomas Becket used.
There is, in the Parker Library at Corpus Christi College in Cambridge, a collection of books put together by the Archbishop of Canterbury, then Archbishop of Canterbury in the 16th century, Matthew Parker. And among them is an extremely well-known, often published Anglo-Saxon Psalter with a 16th century inscription saying, "This is the book that belonged to Becket." And everybody's laughed at this as a little bit of preposterousness. The discovery was a pure chance, looking at the sacrist's inventories of Canterbury Cathedral of 1321, there is a description of a psalter in the list kept at the shrine of Becket, which corresponds exactly to the manuscript as survived. And I think it is absolute that that psalter is the manuscript that was being kept as a relic of Becket.
And you think he may actually have had it with him when he was martyred?
I actually don't know whether he had it with him when he was martyred. However, it had a very, very close personal association with him. When he went abroad, he took it with him. He was described by his friend Herbert of Bosham as being inseparable from this little book. I think it is possible that he had it with him. And if he did, that would explain why it was sent to the shrine and not to the library.
And what does it tell us about him, do you think, that he chose this particular book to keep so close to him?
We know a huge amount about Thomas Becket, where he went and who he met, and reported second-hand what he said. What we don't have is anything remotely personal about his personal faith, his piety, his devotions. And to have stumbled upon a prayer book, a psalter, a book containing psalms as well as personal prayers and invocations of saints, which belonged to him and which he clearly was using or keeping with him all the time, that tells us a little bit about the man himself, a little bit about the quiet hours of the night when he may well have had this book with him. There's also a very circumstantial but really rather good evidence that the manuscript had previously belonged to Alphege, previous Archbishop of Canterbury in the early 11th century, who was martyred by the Danes and was canonised as a saint in the late 11th century. And I think Becket kind of identified himself with the then only previous Archbishop of Canterbury who had been martyred, and I suspect the manuscript was probably already a relic, and Alphege himself may have had it with him when he was martyred, and it may be for that reason that Becket took it into his own possession, and as his life moves into this great kind of vortex towards his inevitable death, he keeps this reminder of the Canterbury martyr with him. And there are several conflicting accounts of what he actually said as he died, but one person who was there said that his last words were to commend his soul to St. Alphege, which he might well have done if he was holding Alphege's book.
Christopher de Havel. The list of those who paid tribute to John Hume, who died this week, included leaders from all over the world and every walk of life, Pope Francis among them. The Northern Ireland political leader and Nobel Peace Prize winner spent some time training for the priesthood before becoming first a teacher and then an activist, and I discussed the religious and moral dimension of his life with the Roman Catholic Bishop of Derry, Donald McKeown, and the broadcaster and writer Eamon Malley.
My overall take on John Hume was that he was fundamentally given to the human condition, and he was humanitarian in every manifestation of his life. He wasn't parochial. He wasn't local, although he was anchored in localism, but there was a universality, a universalism attaching to him. He reminded me of a distinguished Irish poet called Patrick Kavanagh, who saw the back of the house as the world, and Hume saw the back of the house as the world, and the world as the back of his house, back of his home. He had that capacity to see the big picture. I was speaking with his wife, Pat, last week, and she suggested to him that he might cease his conversations with Gerry Adams at the time that there was so much pressure on the family, because Adams and he were in dialogue leading ultimately to the ceasefire. And she said to him, after the awful tragedy of Grace Steele, when he broke down and cried at the funeral, when the daughter of one of the people who'd been killed said, "We prayed for you last night around Daddy's coffin, and please, I hope you will keep on with the talks." Now, the pressure was such in the family that Pat told me she actually said to John, "Would you not reconsider your talks with Gerry Adams?" And he said, "No, I've started, I'm going to continue." And she said to me, and this was very telling, she said to me, he saw the big picture. I only see little pictures.
Well, somebody who saw the big picture, Bishop, but at the same time remained very rooted in his home city and also in Catholicism.
Yes, I think in the question of his being a seminarian for a few years in Maynooth as an undergraduate, I think in many ways he discovered a different sort of vocation, which was that sense of commitment to making the world that he lived in, whether locally or internationally, making it a better place. He had a good sense of duty. John was the eldest of 7 children, really very, very attached to his mother and her dedication in holding the family together when the father couldn't get much work. So I think he was part of that generation who were pickled in Catholic social teaching, where the Good Samaritan gospel of crossing the road, not walking past someone in need, really was sunk into his blood. And he had a strong sense not only of belonging to a local community and working for its well-being, but he also realized that community can be powerful if you can bring people together, if you can build bridges, if you can reach out, if you can be determined. People together are capable of great things. So I think he had part of that sort of almost divine vision for what people could be, and a sense that every individual could make a contribution to building the kingdom of God.
It's very striking, that Eamon Malley in the Northern Ireland context, isn't it? Because we tend to think of religion as something that divides in Northern Ireland, but here was a man with a very strong religious instinct which drove him to try and bring people together.
Yeah, but he wasn't a saint, and he wouldn't have purported to be a saint. I don't have many recollections of John moralizing about social matters in terms of right to life and divorce and all that type of thing. I think he left that very much to legislators and to the churchmen. He wasn't a moralist from that point of view. And one has to remember his makeup. His great-grandfather was a Presbyterian immigrant who settled in Donegal. And John learned this politics at the tea table. I did a lot of work with him down the years. And I recall very vividly when he was doing his homework in the evening, his father was at the other end of the table filling in forms or filling out forms. It depends from which part of the island of Ireland you come, and to helping poor people to claim benefits and that. So John learned his craft of humanitarian goodness at the tea table by the example of his father and his mother. And I think that is quite important. And there was a taciturn dimension to John Hume. He could be good fun, but a lot of the time he was lost in himself. And he could be in a room full of people, and yet you could see him wandering off inside his head, not communicating. It could be very humorous. Like Mark Durkin told me a wonderful anecdote. If John was prosecuting a thesis on something and you challenged it, you went on and challenged it and continued to challenge it. Eventually, John would say to him, "Are you listening to yourself? Because I have to." Mark was his sort of protege. Mark said at that point, "You knew not to go any further." The argument was over.
It's important to say, isn't it, Bishop, that although he was internationally recognised and recognised as a really big figure, he did remain very, very attached to his community and lived in a very modest way.
He certainly did. He just lived round the corner. He was here at Mass in the cathedral every day when he was fit for it, would come back in the evening and say some prayers privately. So he never lost a sense of where he came from, because he learnt the insights that he got about analysing a problem correctly. And I think he analysed our problem correctly, our local problem, that it wasn't a question of the British getting loyalists and Republicans round the table. It was a question of someone getting the Republicans and the British establishment round the table. So he really was focused on what would help this local community. I think, yes, he became an international figure because he learnt a lesson that perhaps could be applicable in any sort of context. But he really was keen, analyse the problem well, and then provide the solution, and be dogged in ensuring that the bridges are built that make that solution possible. So he built connections with Europe, but he built huge connections with the States to put pressure on all the partners, from America to put pressure on the Republicans to move beyond their strategy, and through Europe to put pressure on the British, I think, to come to the table and actually find the solution with the three strands to it that we have in the Good Friday Agreement. So John had an ability to analyse things concretely, locally, and then to muster international energies to deliver something for the good of the people locally.
Eamon Malley, the Good Friday Agreement is a while ago now. Does he remain, do you think, an influential figure for people in Northern Ireland?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, to say, for my generation, Edward, you've got to understand, we came from similar backgrounds, a poor background with very little hope. Education was our only way out. Hume came out of that sort of basket. So, it was simplicity. Hume realized that poverty disempowers people. And arising from that type of awareness, he founded and contributed to the local society there to avoid people having to go to the loan sharks. He established what the equivalent of a local bank for the poor people of his city. Now, that was so visionary. He saw the connection between poverty and lack of political power, and he built upon that.
Is he somebody who influenced your life, Bishop, and indeed influenced your understanding of your vocation?
I think certainly. I had gone to university in Queen's, Belfast in 1968, just as the Troubles were beginning. So in many ways, he was a figure about, say, 10, 15 years ahead of me in terms of age. But he had a huge footprint in terms of believing that it was possible to find a solution when everybody else said that the only way forward is by smashing the other side.
The Bishop of Derry and Eamon Malley. And that's it for this week's Sunday. If you'd like to comment on the programme, you can email us at sunday@bbc.co.uk or write to us at Dockhouse Media City UK, Salford M50 2LH. And you can, of course, listen again or download the programme as a podcast from the BBC Sounds app. William Crawley will be in the chair next week. Enjoy the rest of your Sunday.